Charterhouse is a tiny hamlet high in the Mendip Hills of Somerset in England, once a medieval and Victorian lead mining community, and later almost abandoned. By the early 1980s, it consisted of just a former church and a school, which Somerset County Council had converted into an outdoor education centre for youth groups. Rugged moorland, ancient oak woods and limestone caves surround the site, giving it a timeless and somewhat isolated atmosphere. Despite the scenic beauty, an air of mystery clings to Charterhouse. Local law hints at very strange secrets hidden in those hills. In fact, some visitors describe an uncanny feeling in the area. According to one explorer, you never really feel alone here. There's always the presence of something other. The Charterhouse Centre itself, in 1982, was a rustic but functional facility. It offered bunk accommodation, a dining hall, and classrooms for visiting students, and even a small infirmary, aka the sick bay. At night, there was no resident manager on duty, often just a warden or teachers in charge. The Mendip Cave Rescue Team also used the centre's outbuildings to store their equipment. In this remote, self-contained setting, miles from the nearest village, a group of school children and their teachers arrived in winter 1982, unaware that they were about to become part of one of Somerset's strangest modern ghost stories. In February 1982, a party from Haygrove School in Bridgewater came to Charterhouse for a weekend of outdoor education. One of the supervising teachers was Richard Gardner, a science instructor known for his level-headedness. He was assigned to look after a small group of 5 15-year-old girls on hikes and activities. The trip went smoothly at first, until one drizzly afternoon when the class returned from a trek across the moors and they realised one girl was missing. The missing student, named Maria, had last been seen on the trail not far from the centre. Fearing she might be lost in the increasingly bad weather, the staff initiated a search. Gardner jumped into the centre's van and retraced the hiking route through the windswept hills, periodically stopping to get out and call the girl's name. By now, daylight was fading, and a cold rain had intensified into a downpour, slashing across the deserted uplands, and suddenly he heard something utterly unexpected. In the distance, carrying through the wind and rain, came the sound of children laughing and playing. He paused, baffled. The cheerful voices of young children echoed out as if from an unseen schoolyard. But Gardner stood in open countryside. He knew there were no houses or farms nearby, and the nearest village was 5 miles away, and certainly no children would be out in a storm just for fun. Peering through sheets of rain, the teacher saw nothing but empty fields and swaying trees. The laughter had a strange, disembodied quality. It faded on the wind almost as soon as he'd registered it. Gardner later admitted that the experience sent a chill down his spine, a realization that something was not right in those darkening woods. Abandoning the search in that area, he drove back to the Charterhouse Centre. To his immense relief, Maria was there waiting. Soaked and somewhat embarrassed, she explained that she'd wandered off the trail to examine a wildflower and then lost sight of the group. Eventually, she managed to find her way back on her own. Aside from being cold and a bit shaken, the girl was fine, and the immediate crisis, therefore, was over. Yet, as the reunited class huddled into the warm refuge of the centre that evening, Richard Gardner couldn't shake the memory of those phantom children's voices. He knew what he thought he heard out on the moor, but it made no sense who or what had been out there laughing. in the rain. That night, the students and teachers gathered in a lounge room at Charterhouse, excitedly chattering about the day's events. The odd mystery of those laughing voices naturally became the hot topic of conversation. At dinner, as rain peppered the windows and wind howled down the chimney, the group's mood turned toward the spooky and the supernatural. They began swapping ghost stories in an attempt to explain, or perhaps make light of, what had just happened. Some of the teenagers recounted legends they'd heard or eerie experiences from home. The atmosphere was one of nervous laughter, the kind of giddy fear that arises when real life starts to feel like a campfire tale. Among the adults present was the Charterhouse Centre's resident warden, a man named Terry. As the hour grew later, one of the students half-jokingly asked Terry if he had ever seen a ghost, or anything strange around the Charterhouse. The expectation was that this no-nonsense ex-soldier would dismiss the idea with a grin. Terry was a former Royal Marine Commando, a stout and practically minded man in his 30s who commanded respect even from unruly kids. He wasn't the type to indulge in fanciful stories, which is why his reaction surprised everybody. Terry hesitated, and then he replied candidly that, yes, he had experienced something that he couldn't explain. In fact, the warden confessed that it was the single most frightening night of his life. Terry's story took place about a year earlier, in 1981, on a night when the Charterhouse Centre was almost empty. The winter had been a quiet season for bookings, and one weekend Terry found himself alone, on site, performing maintenance. He spent the day servicing the Mendip Cave Rescue Team's gear stored at the centre, checking the ropes and drying out the tents, and just repairing equipment. And by the time he'd finished his tasks, darkness had already fallen and a steady rain had set in. Rather than drive home on the slick, rural roads, Terry decided to spend the night at the centre and head home first thing in the morning. After a simple supper in the kitchen and an hour of reading and television, Terry locked up the buildings, the only person on the entire property. He double-checked the doors and the windows as a security measure. Satisfied that everything was secure, he retired to the small sick bay room to sleep. The sick bay was a little infirmary with a single metal frame bed for overnight staff or ill students. It lay at the end of a hallway on the first floor of the main building. Outside, the rain fell heavier as midnight came and went. And then at around 1 a.m., Terry was jolted awake by a rustling noise outside the building. In his groggy state, he initially thought some animal was nosing around, perhaps a badger or a fox. They were common to the area after all. Grumbling, he rolled over and tried to go back to sleep, reasoning that a foraging animal would soon move on. And sure enough, the scuffling sounds died down momentarily, and Terry drifted off to sleep again. But not for long. He woke again to the sound of rustling and scraping, and this time, unmistakably, coming from inside the building's ground floor. Fully alert now, he sat up. The old centre was creaky, but these noises were not the usual groans of the timber or the pipes. It sounded like an animal had somehow broken in and was shuffling around the corridors. Terry's mind raced through the possibilities. A stray dog, a badger potentially, but he knew that he'd locked every door. How could a wild animal open a door or a window? The thought of a human intruder crossed his mind, but these noises were odd. A kind of snuffling and clawing at the floorboards that did not sound human. As he listened, the noises grew closer, moving through the building with deliberate steps. Terry's heart began to pound. Whatever it was seemed to be coming up the wooden stairs towards the bedrooms. He could hear a heavy scraping on each step, accompanied by a wet, animal-type breathing. In the absolute darkness of the sick bay, Terry strained his ears. The creature for by now he was convinced that some creature was inside, reached the top of the stairs. Terry, a battle-hardened ex-commando, felt a prickle of fear. No animal does this, he thought. Not in an occupied building. It was as if the intruder knew he was there and was purposefully approaching him. Suddenly the noises stopped, and Terry realized with dread that the intruder had reached the other side of his closed door. Just inches of solid wood separated him from whatever it was that was out there. In the darkness he held his breath. A few seconds of silence, and then a new sound sent a jolt of terror flowing through him. A loud sniffing at the gap under the door. A heavy exhalation, and then scratching. It sounded as if a large animal was pressed right up against the door, sniffing him out like a hound on a scent. Terry's mouth went dry. He later admitted that he had never felt fear like he had in that moment. Somehow, impossibly, this entity was forcing an entry into his room through a space no living creature larger than a rat could have fit. The implication was clear. This was not an ordinary animal. Terry was frozen in disbelief as he heard it scrape and slither its way inside. In the darkness of the sick bay, he couldn't see anything, but he could hear it, and he could sense it. An overwhelming feeling of a presence came over him, primal and malevolent. For a moment there was only heavy breathing in the blackness. Terry, a man trained to face enemy gunfire, now found himself too terrified to move. If I go for the door, I might touch it by accident, or it might grab me, he reasoned, so he stayed absolutely still. What happened next was utter chaos. The unseen entity suddenly lunged at the bed. The metal frame bunk jerked and rocked violently, slamming against the wall. Terry clung on as his mattress bucked. It was as though a powerful pair of hands or paws had seized the bedposts and were shaking them like a rage-filled intruder trying to wake him up. The assault was accompanied by guttural snorts and an ear-splitting shriek that reminded him of an animal in fury. Terry recalls shouting in alarm and gripping a wall-mounted electrical conduit for support. Plaster was raining down from the ceiling where the old building vibrated from the force of the attack, and for nearly a full minute the heavy bunk was battered back and forth while its occupant feared for his life. And then, just as abruptly as it began, the attack stopped. The bed thumped down into the stillness. Through the ringing in his ears, Terry heard the creature retreating. The snuffling, scraping sounds moved away from him, back out under the door, with an otherworldly ease. It descended the staircase, its footsteps thudding dully until the sound dissolved into the ambient creaks of the old house. Only the drumming of rain on the roof remained. Shaking and drenched in sweat, Terry looked at his watch. It was now around 2 a.m. The terrifying ordeal had lasted about an hour, from the first noise to that final silence. He spent the rest of that night sitting awake on the bunk, with the lights on and his heart pounding, expecting the thing to return at any moment. But it didn't. And by dawn the storm had cleared, and in the grey morning light Terry surveyed the aftermath. Fine white plaster dust coated his blanket. It was dislodged from the ceiling or walls by the bed's impact. The electrical cable he had braced against hung loose, yanked from its conduit mount on the wall. There were no tracks, there were no claw marks anywhere to suggest that a flesh-and-blood animal had been there. All the doors were still locked from the inside. Terry was left with no rational explanation. Something seemingly impossible had invaded his space that night. As he finished this story to the Haygrove group, he admitted softly, "I have never been so frightened before or since." Terry's hair-raising account hung in the air of the Charterhouse lounge. The students and fellow teachers sat stunned. Some mouths hung open, and the crackling of the fireplace was the only sound. A heavy sense of dread settled over the gathering as each person realized that this was not a ghost story from far away or from long ago. It was right here, in the very buildings they were sleeping in. Gardner and the other adults exchanged uneasy glances. Was it possible that something like that really lurked in Charterhouse? If a no-nonsense ex-Marine believed it, who were they to dismiss it outright? The faces around the room were pale and serious. That night, nobody at Charterhouse wanted to sleep alone. Normally, the students would head out across the yard to a separate dormitory block, and teachers would go to their private rooms. But not tonight. The entire group decided to bunk down together in the main building's lounge where they'd heard the tale. They dragged in blankets and cushions and dozed in armchairs or on the floor in their sleeping bags, a few lamps left on for comfort. Every creak of the old centre that night made hearts race. Needless to say, nothing else unusual occurred. Perhaps the noisy human company kept any spooks at bay, but for those present, the memory of Terry's late-night visitor would be impossible to forget. Gardner eventually recounted the experience to a paranormal researcher named Betty Puttick many years later, providing the first detailed record of the incident in her book, Supernatural England. Through Puttick's account, what started as an oral tale shared by wide-eyed teenagers became a part of England's catalogue of ghost lore, albeit a very modern and very bizarre entry. But the story didn't end in 82, because roughly a year later, in 83, another school group visited Charterhouse for a similar outdoor adventure programme. Among the incoming staff was a teacher who had been present on that fateful night in 1982. Naturally, one of the first people he sought out on arrival was Terry himself, perhaps to ask if there had been any other developments. The gruff warden quietly handed the returning teacher a folded piece of paper as they greeted each other, and on it, written in Terry's unmistakable writing, were 5 words that made the teacher's blood run cold. "My visitor returned last week." Introducing the Eerie's Vault Patreon page with several membership options, the first of which is Eerie's Entourage, where you will get early access to some of the videos and of course your name listed in the video credits as a supporter of this growing channel. Eerie's Exceptionals will get the previous perks, plus exclusive on-location footage when it's available, occasional Patreon exclusive videos, access to clippings and research materials used in the creation of the Eerie's Vaults videos. And if you're an Eerie's expert, you will get all of the above, plus access to Eerie's Isles, an interactive Google Earth map with hundreds of sightings and event locations pinned, which will get updated regularly as the channel progresses. Head on over to Eerie's Vault at Patreon and discover a treasure trove of the uncanny, the paranormal, and the weird. Aside from Richard Gardner and Terry's dramatic testimonies, were there any other witnesses to strange phenomena at Charterhouse? In the immediate aftermath, the early 80s, there are no other official reports that I can find. The centre's staff and visiting teachers likely kept things quiet to avoid alarming the children or inviting ridicule. However, hints of other odd occurrences have surfaced over time. Charterhouse's wardens and instructors in later years sometimes exchanged stories of unexplained incidents, minor compared to Terry's ordeal, but eerie nonetheless. In an interview decades later, one long-time staff member commented that most people have had some sort of ghostly experience here. These experiences typically involve unexplained noises, doors found unlocked or opened on their own, or the feeling of not being alone in empty rooms. While such anecdotes are hard to verify, they do suggest that the site's spooky reputation has endured. For example, staff locking up at night occasionally heard what sounded like footsteps in empty corridors or faint human voices in the distance, only to find that there is nobody there. A few have felt sudden cold drafts or a sensation of being watched while walking on the grounds after dark. One instructor in the 90s claimed that a bunk bed shook on its own in the dormitory when he was there. In the years after Puttick published Gardner's and Terry's experiences, the tale of the Charterhouse entity began to appear in paranormal magazines and blogs and TV and radio programs, YouTube channels of course. Enthusiasts on internet forums dissected the known details, dubbing the case the creature of Charterhouse, or sometimes the Charterhouse guest. Some storytellers have taken to calling the unseen assailant the Charterhouse Devil. Despite this notoriety amongst ghost hunters, no formal investigation seems to have ever been conducted there. The only documentation of the incident remains the personal accounts of those who were there, Richard Gardner's report, as recorded by Betty Puttick. So what really happened then at Charterhouse from 81 to 83? In the absence of any definitive proof, a number of theories have been proposed. They generally fall into two broad camps, the paranormal and the skeptical, of course, each trying to make sense of these bizarre events. Those inclined to believe in the supernatural view the Charterhouse incidents as genuine hauntings or encounters with an unknown entity. Some theorise that the laughter Richard Gardner heard could be a residual haunting, perhaps an imprint of long-ago children who attended the old Victorian schoolhouse. The building was once a village school, after all. In this line of thinking, strong emotional energy from the past could echo under the right conditions. For example, the popular stone tape theory of ghostly recordings. The far more aggressive presence that terrorised Terry might be something different, possibly an elemental spirit tied to the land, or even a demonic entity, given its inhuman behaviour. It's not lost on paranormal enthusiasts that the Mendip Hills have a long, ancient history. They speculate that Charterhouse's very strange secrets could include curses or spirits disturbed by centuries of mining or something lurking in the nearby caves. The fact that the entity seemingly targeted a lone individual at night and returned again suggests to believers an intelligent haunting, as opposed to one of a residual ghost. In short, the paranormal camp sees no natural explanation for an invisible creature squeezing under a door and shaking a bed. To them, Charterhouse was, and perhaps remains, home to a malevolent spirit. Critics and skeptics, meanwhile, of course, look for rational causes. They note that human perception, especially under stress or in unfamiliar environments, can be notoriously unreliable. For instance, Richard Gardner's experience of hearing phantom children might be explained by auditory illusion or misinterpretation. In a storm, sound can travel in odd ways. Perhaps the wind carried the distant echoes of real children from a farm in the distance, or the sound of animals, perhaps, that resembled laughter. Gardner was also under some anxiety searching for a missing student, which could have primed him to imagine a sound like a child's voice. Terry's Night of Terror, however, offers more of a challenge to explain away, but skeptics have tried. One suggestion is sleep paralysis, that condition where a person wakes but is unable to move and may hallucinate a presence. Even physical sensations come with that sometimes. Some classic sleep paralysis hallucinations include feeling the bed shake or a creature sitting on your chest. It's sometimes called old hag syndrome. Could Terry's vivid account be an extreme case of this? Terry did wake from sleep to see, or rather hear and sense, frightening things. However, Terry was able to move. He grabbed the cable on the wall, didn't he? And he was convinced that he was fully awake during that incident, which complicates that theory a little. Another mundane explanation is a real animal intruder, perhaps a large dog or even some sort of farm animal that somehow pushed into the building and jostled the bed, but no animal was found, and it stretches belief really that a stray dog could rock a heavy bunker so violently that plaster fell from the ceiling. Some have even mused about earth tremors shaking that building, combined with a sort of half-dream state on Terry's part. Local records, however, show no earthquake activity that night, and tremors don't scratch at doors or sound like snuffling beasts. Ultimately, the skeptical camp leans towards the idea that Terry experienced a profound nightmare or waking hallucination. Terry, the ex-Marine warden, moved on from Charterhouse a couple of years later. It's said on his last day he pointed out the sick bay to his replacement and simply offered, "Good luck in there." He reportedly refused to ever again spend the night at the centre alone. Wherever Terry is now, one imagines he still bears the invisible scars of that terrifying encounter. In recounting the story, Betty Puttick noted that Terry's humility and frankness about what he went through meant he obviously had nothing to gain by making it all up. According to Puttick, Terry's final word on the matter was essentially, "People can believe me or not, but I know what I experienced." If you ever find yourself on the windswept plateaus of Charterhouse at night, you might just recall this story and catch yourself listening for phantom giggles or scratching at the door. And if you happen to be staying in the centre and notice that something goes bump in the night, well, you know the legacy you might be up against. As the Strange Company blog Riley puts it, perhaps it's best not to check for monsters under the bed at Charterhouse, because there might just be one there.